My name is Kaylee Yeager, and the date today is November 5th, 2020. So today I'm discussing feedback loops and the non-gravid or non-pregnant female reproductive system. We'll begin our discussion by talking about the anatomy of the female reproductive system, and it's split into two different parts, the internal and external, or vulva. So the internal reproductive system is comprised of the ovary, the cervix, the uterus, the uterine tubes, and the upper part of the vagina. The ovaries produce the gametes, in this case eggs, and hormones. The cervix protrudes slightly into the upper end of the vagina, and the cervical canal is lined with mucus glands, whose secretions create a protective barrier between the vagina and the uterus. The cervix is also what becomes wide during labor to allow the baby to enter the vagina. The vagina allows for sexual intercourse, menstrual blood flow, and childbirth. The uterine tubes is where fertilization takes place, and the uterus is where the fetus develops. The vulva consists of the clitoris, the urethral orifice, the vagina, the labia majora, and the labia minora. The labia majora are folds of skin that arise from the same embryonic tissue as the scrotum. The labia minora is derived from embryonic tissues that in the male give rise to the shaft of the penis. The clitoris, you can see up in the top of the diagram here, is a small bud of erectile sensory tissue at the anterior end of the vulva, and this has lots of nerve endings. And the urethral orifice is where urine is excreted. So the main thing that we'll be talking about today is the menstrual cycle, and this can be described as either the ovarian cycle or the uterine cycle. The ovarian cycle is split into three different phases. The first one is the follicular phase, which is a period of follicular growth in the ovary, and this lasts about 10 to 21 days. Ovulation is when one or more follicles have ripened and the ovary releases oocytes. And the luteal phase is the transformation of a ruptured follicle into a corpus luteum, which secretes hormones that continue the preparations for pregnancy. And if pregnancy doesn't occur, the corpus luteum ceases to function after about 2 weeks and the ovarian cycle begins again. In the uterine cycle, there are also three different phases. The first one is menses, which is when there's menstrual bleeding from the uterus. The second one is the proliferative phase, which is where the endometrium adds a new layer of cells in anticipation of pregnancy. And then there's the secretory phase, which is the luteal phase, which corresponds to the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. And hormones from the corpus luteum converts the thickened endometrium into a secretory structure. And if no pregnancy occurs, the superficial layers of the secretory endometrium are lost during menstruation as the uterine cycle begins again. And then there are a few main hormones involved in these cycles. The first one we'll talk about is gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, and this is a hormone that is released from the hypothalamus and is responsible for the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and both of those are secreted from the anterior pituitary. And these are both called gonadotropins, which are hormones released from the anterior pituitary that act on the gonads or the ovaries or testes. Gonadotropins also include what's called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, which is a hormone used to detect pregnancy, but we won't discuss that here. And both LH and FSH play an important role in sexual development and functioning. Specifically, luteinizing hormone triggers the release of an egg from the ovary, and FSH helps control the menstrual cycle and stimulates the growth of eggs in the ovaries. And the highest level of FSH happens just before an egg is released by the ovary. And then there are also ovarian hormones, and these include estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. The ovarian hormones are all produced by the ovaries, and they are also called sex hormones. The main two are estrogen and progesterone, but inhibin is also important to note while we're talking about feedback loops. Estrogen, or specifically estradiol, is instrumental in breast development and the development of reproductive hormones. And when pregnant, it also increased estrogen signals posterior pituitary to release oxytocin to cause uterine contractions. Progesterone prepares the body for pregnancy by causing the uterine lining to thicken, and when pregnant, it prevents uterine contractions and prepares breast for lactation. And inhibin is important for signaling to the pituitary to inhibit FSH secretion. And there are a few different phases that we'll talk about in regard to feedback loops. The first being the early to mid follicular phase. And this is where, as you can see down here, the follicles grow under the influence of FSH and LH, which are stimulated by the secretion of GnRH from the hypothalamus. And these two hormones act on the follicle. And there are two different types of cells in the follicle. There are the granulosa cells and the thecal cells. The granulosa cells secrete anti-Müllerian hormone, or AMH, and this prevents more follicles from developing. And they also secrete estrogen, and this increased estrogen level has a couple of different effects. So there's both a positive feedback loop and a negative feedback loop involved with estrogen here. The positive feedback loop is acted on the granulosa cells, and this allows the follicles to continue estrogen production even though FSH and LH levels decrease. And that is part of the negative feedback loop that you can see here. So the increase in estrogens inhibits both FSH and GnRH production. And then the thecal cells produce androgens, and those are converted into estrogen and then help with both of the types of feedback loops. The second phase that we'll discuss is the late follicular phase and ovulation. And this phase is marked by rising levels of estrogen and also increasing levels of progesterone, although there's a much higher estrogen output than there is of progesterone. Both the estrogen and the progesterone are involved in positive feedback loops to GnRH, and progesterone specifically is involved in a positive feedback loop to luteinizing hormone, as you can see right here. And this is involved in what is called a luteinizing hormone surge, and this triggers the secretion of numerous chemical signals that are necessary for the final steps of oocyte maturation. Meiosis resumes in the developing follicle with the first meiotic division as a result of this surge, and it also divides the primary oocyte into a secondary oocyte and a first polar body, which disintegrates FSH, which disintegrates. In this phase, FSH also surges, although to a lesser degree, and this is due to the estrogen output acting on the GnRH, and there being an increase in secretion there, which in turn increases the secretion of FSH, but at the same time, inhibin inhibits FSH from being secreted and acting on the follicle. And also as a result of the high levels of estrogen being produced, it prepares the uterus for a possible pregnancy. Next, we'll talk about the early to mid luteal phase, and this is marked by what's called luteinization, which is where both thecal cells and granulosa cells transform into luteal cells of the corpus luteum. And here, lipid droplets and glycogen granules accumulate and begin to secrete hormones, and this produces steadily increasing amounts of progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin. These increasing amounts of estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin exerts negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And gonadotropin, or LH-FSH levels are diminished, and the gonadotropin secretion remains shut down throughout most of the luteal phase. And then under the influence of progesterone, which is the dominant hormone in this phase, the endometrium continues to prepare for pregnancy and becomes a secretory structure, which helps to develop the placenta and also thickening of the cervical mucus and creates a plug that blocks the cervical opening. And then the last phase that we're going to discuss is the late luteal phase. And in this phase, you can see that the corpus luteum spontaneously dies. It actually has a lifespan of approximately 12 days, and if pregnancy doesn't occur, then it spontaneously dies. As a result of this, there is a decrease in both estrogen and progesterone levels. And these decreased levels remove the negative feedback to the pituitary gland in the hypothalamus, and so FSH and LH levels begin to increase once again. And as a result, the blood vessels in the surface layer of the endometrium contract, and eventually it begins to slough its surface layer and begins menstruation. And then new follicles begin to develop and the cycle begins again. And these are my sources.